Welcome back. It's time for another tier list, and I know what you're thinking. Wow, really uncreative. 3 of these in a row? Yeah, well, you can probably guess why some of my other video plans have been interrupted. It should be pretty clear by now, and it's actually been pretty hard to find time to even record things, because there's just a lot more people in my immediate vicinity who aren't going outside. So I guess I'm doing a tier list again, because I have some time, and I might as well. Because I can't think of a more relevant series to do one on right now than Resident Evil, also known as Biohazard in Japan. I actually replayed a bunch of these games recently, as well as played several that I'd never touched before. I feel like this is definitely a good time to kind of talk about this series. Resident Evil, a series that I do like quite a bit, really set a benchmark for survival horror in a lot of ways, but has also gone in so many different directions that there is a lot to talk about when you talk about what the series has been, where it is now, things like that. So I think this is a great series to do a tier list for. Rules I want to get out of the way. If there's a remake of a game, the remake is taking precedence here. I'm not going to be reviewing the original Resident Evil and the remake in the same kind of list format here. We're just doing the remake. That goes for pretty much all the remakes that I'm aware of. Maybe you're disappointed by that, but those are the games that are more easily accessible for people right now, and the games that I have more of a memory of, to be quite honest. So that's what we're doing. We're also not counting spin-offs that just aren't survival horror games. So we're pretty much doing all of the mainline games and the spin-offs that fit into the essence of what Resident Evil is. So as much as I like something like Umbrella Chronicles, you're not going to see it here. So I suppose we're going to start as close to the beginning as we can get, which would be the remake of Resident Evil for the GameCube. I'm going to put that in the A tier, because I do think it's really great. I think it's actually one of the best remakes that's ever been made, because it didn't come out that much longer after the original, but there's just such a tremendous difference in the fidelity of it. While it's still pretty true to the original design, it just shows you how far gaming can go in a pretty short span of time. I think it's very interesting on that level. It does preserve a lot of the creepiness while adding things like the Crimson Head zombies that I thought were a great idea. It's a game that is very challenging, don't get me wrong, and some people might be turned off by that challenge. But there's definitely a lot that you could learn from this game, as far as, being a game that set a lot of benchmarks for survival horror, as well as making it more scary. This is much scarier than the original Resident Evil, in my opinion. And it's funny because, the voice acting in this game, I don't think it's that great either, but it's a massive step up from the original as well. So, I think just from a presentation standpoint, this is a really interesting game. And also, it's a classic. If you've played survival horror games and you haven't played this, I don't know what you're doing. You have to play this. Come on. Classic game. Challenging game. Resident Evil, I think this is such a simple little game compared to what would come later. Sometimes simple is better. And this is definitely a case where that's what I would say. So I think we're going to move along. You know what? I guess we'll just talk about it now. This is one of the more recent Resident Evil games. Technically, that would be the remake of Resident Evil 2, which I am going to put into the S tier because I think this game is really excellent. But I do see it as being more of a departure from the original, whereas I think the remake of 1 was trying harder to be faithful. I think this game tries a little bit more to be its own thing, but it still really preserves what makes a Resident Evil experience great. And we have totally different control schemes. It's closer to the newer games. But I think that in some ways, this is almost like a perfect Resident Evil game. The zombies in this game, compared to really any other, they totally capture what a zombie should be and how difficult of a threat they can be, how recurring of a threat they can be too. That's what I love. It's almost impossible to actually get rid of zombies. So the game doesn't really have those points like you might have in some other Resident Evil games where you can just clear out the enemies and not have to worry about it. Oh, you are going to have to worry about most of these threats for the whole game. So you really have to always be on edge. And I think it's a great looking game. The police station, just seeing how they kind of revamped it and stuff, it's really amazing to explore. That's not to say this game doesn't have some issues. I do think that the police station, it's so iconic that once you leave it, The game is not quite as interesting. But, people really love things like Mr. X, which were, of course, expanded upon. That's basically a giant meme now. Mr. X is great, even though he's not actually in the game for that much time. A lot of the additions that they added to the story as well, I think, work quite well. It's just generally it perfectly captures the anticipation that you have when you play a Resident Evil game, because you're going to have to deal with something, and you've just got to make it through those rooms and just hightail it. Yeah, just really an excellent game that if you haven't played this one, this actually might be a great one to start with. Very accessible, but also very challenging, especially if you play on the higher difficulties. You try playing something like the Fourth Survivor. Oh boy, yeah. I just really love this, and this is the style of Resident Evil game that I want to see more of, personally. Because I know that 7 has tried to do its own thing, and I like 7, but this to me feels more like the direction I want Resident Evil to go in. So I love this style, and I want to see more done with it. So I guess then we are going to go to game Resident Evil 3, the remake. That I'm going to put in the B tier. I do like it a lot, but I just think that it has some shortcomings compared to the 2 remake. To be honest, though, many of those shortcomings were things that were present in the original game. Resident Evil 3 is a very short game. And because it only had one storyline, it didn't have the same replay value as 2. And that's still an issue here with the remake. It is very short. It does not have a lot of replay value unless you like the challenge, that's the skill-based challenges. And I beat this game on Nightmare with the S rank, and it was really thrilling, and I enjoyed it a lot. But I can't help but wish that we had something like the Fourth Survivor, Operation Mad Jackal, whatever you want to call it. I wish we had some extra mode or something that we could do in this, because it just feels like it's missing something. And maybe that'll get patched in, but I really don't know at this point. I also think that a lot of the reason that you've seen people be very critical of this game is because it's not worth $60. It just isn't. That's a bad deal if you're getting it at full price. And I know that it comes with that multiplayer game, but I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about any multiplayer Resident Evil games here. Yeah, I mean, I do like this game a lot. I think that it's a great attempt at making a game that is true to Resident Evil, but also has more action elements. But I do wish that the game had a little something extra. Maybe if it had, like, at least one extra area, park, had somehow been put into the game, because that was an area that they cut. Just adding something to make it a little bit longer, and it could have been really great. So I like it, but it is going in the B tier for now. I guess that's sort of the original 3, even though some of these games are super recent. We're going to go now to talk about a game called Code Veronica. Code Veronica. Okay, this was a game from, 1999? It was a Dreamcast game, and then was very quickly ported over to the PS2. Yeah, this is a game that I think a lot of people have said is trash. I don't actually think it's that bad. I think that it still has most of what you want out of this era of Resident Evil games. It doesn't really have a lot of glaringly poor design choices, in my opinion. I do like the island. I like the areas and locations you explore. They're very Resident Evil-like, and I especially like how you kind of like loop through them in ways that feel pretty natural. You find like these secret passages connecting them and stuff. Very interesting. I do think this game mostly has problems with the story, because it's got a lot more story than the Resident Evil games came up to this point. But it's got more cutscenes. Cutscenes are not good. Script is not good. A lot of the concepts that they try to make scary aren't scary, mostly because of that. And I think there are some awkward story problems, especially when they try to integrate Chris into the game. It's very strange. The pacing in this whole game is very, very odd. Like, a lot of this game, you kind of feel like you're really close to the end of the game. It's very strange. Like when the self-destruct sequence is happening and you haven't gotten that far in the game. Something's very strange. Still, I think this game is pretty fun. It does have some scares. It has some interesting ideas. From a plot perspective, it's kind of a significant entry in the franchise, because you have characters from Resident Evil 1 and 2 finally meeting. It's supposedly kind of like their stories are coming together here. Not to mention there are actually references to this game in Resident Evil 7, which I was really shocked by. I think that this is a game that I'd absolutely love to see get a remake. I don't know if it's happening. I think a lot of elements of the story that are really weird and strange and kind of silly, if they were just written a bit better, could totally work. there are some nice ideas. And actually, if you've played the Dark Side Chronicles, I think that even in that game, which is just a rail shooter, they did a better job of trying to handle the material in the story. So I don't think this game's irredeemable, and I would like to see this game get remade, because I do think it's good. But yeah, this is kind of a deep cut. Don't play this if you're just trying to get into Resident Evil. But I think that it'll scratch an itch for some people. Okay, we're going to Resident Evil 0. This is another game that I think people are pretty mixed on. I'm putting this in the C tier. I think that a lot of the ideas, while they are neat, are not implemented as well as they could be. This is a game that it almost feels like they wanted this to be some kind of a co-op game, but it's not, because you play as two people, you have to do item management, you have to work together on puzzles, but it's not a cooperative experience, so a lot of it just feels very, very tedious. And you have to carry around items the whole game, or just put them on the floor somewhere. That's probably the worst thing about the game. And I don't think a lot of the enemies are that interesting. The location is neat, but really, yeah, the story of this game is not done that well. It's not very long. I got to the end of it and I was like, what? Yeah, I just don't think that it's really all that interesting, but it's not terrible. If you enjoyed the Resident Evil remake and you want to try something a little different, this is there. This is alright. This game has less cutscenes than Code Veronica, so that's the thing. Even though the story of this game is also probably pretty dumb, it is not as in your face, so I don't really hold that against it too much. I just think that the attempts at making a partner-based game did not quite work here, but that's still significant because a lot of Resident Evil games have tried to do this since then, so this is kind of like the building blocks for a trend down the road. Okay, so now we are going to Resident Evil 4. Wow. What can I say about Resident Evil 4? I still remember when this game was new. People were losing their minds. Because this was a huge departure. Because this is the beginning of Resident Evil becoming more action-focused. And even though this game may not have the best presentation, it's incredibly corny, the sound design is bad, but this is a really excellent game. I still think that it is. I think that even though maybe it's not as scary in the sense it doesn't have as many jump scares, but I think this game does have a pretty good atmosphere, and as far as moment-to-moment gameplay, super tense to play through. Your controller will sweat. Just a lot of the action sequences have a lot of tension, whether it's because you gotta protect Ashley, or most of the time just because these enemies, man, they'll just come from anywhere. You can get overwhelmed, and it's bad when that happens. So it's a really thrilling game. Lots of thinking. You have to make a lot of decisions. The shop, that's an addition that normally I wouldn't be a fan of having a shop in a Resident Evil game. But you do have to think pretty intelligently when you use that. Do I hold on to all this treasure now? Or do I try to wait, see if I can combine it, make something better, and then have even more money to spend to upgrade my stuff? It's a very well done shop system in an action game. Yeah, it's a game that certainly is memorable, even though, yeah, story's not amazing. A lot of very one-note characters, but people still kind of laugh at them, and, a lot of the dialogue is kind of funny to think about now. Yeah, I mean, this game will get remade. It is an inevitability. I highly doubt the cheesy atmosphere, the cheesy dialogue, will be preserved, but that atmosphere that it does have, especially in the early parts of the game, I can see that really being expanded upon. Lots of great enemies, too. Just a really creative entry in the Resident Evil franchise that took things in a totally different direction and had a massive influence on... it's funny, because you could say that this game was the beginning of a bad influence on Resident Evil, but it had a tremendous influence on action games in general. And for that, it is a super significant entry that I would put in the S tier. So what is next after that? That's Resident Evil 5. This might surprise some people, but I'm putting this all the way down in the D tier. I don't think this game is terrible or anything like that, but in a weird way, even though Resident Evil 4 is an older game, I think this game holds up worse. Because Resident Evil 4, you at least can recognize it as coming out in early 2005, whereas Resident Evil 5 is coming out in like 08. We've had a lot of action games since then. We've had things like Gears of War, and that whole generation of action games is in full swing. So this game feeling kind of archaic is not helping it, because it just kind of feels like it's behind the times at this point. It doesn't feel like it's this brave new thing. And there are some neat ideas. I like that the game is co-op. I actually think that if you aren't playing this game co-op, you're going to have a much worse time. If you play this with a friend today, you're probably still going to have some fun. I would recommend it on that level. But playing it alone is just not really that enriching anymore. It's also kind of annoying because this game is kind of the culmination of Resident Evil's story in a lot of ways, whereas 4 did not really have anything to do with the overall storyline. This is all about Chris Redfield versus Albert Wesker. Like, this is the conclusion. The stakes have never really been higher. I don't think the story is that great, but it gets the job done, I suppose. Still, you don't always play Resident Evil games for the story. Yeah, I don't know. This game just isn't really that memorable when you compare it to something like 4. And so I have to put it down here for that reason. But then we're going to a spin-off game. This would be Resident Evil Revelations. Originally a 3DS game that was then ported. So yeah, Revelations, I'm going to put that in C tier because I like about half of the game. Yeah, that's kind of the odd thing to say. I like half of this game. The main storyline, which involves Jill on an abandoned cruise line, pretty good. I think this game has an interesting atmosphere. It has some enemies that I think are pretty creepy and work well. I just think that half of this game isn't that great because so here's kind of the main issue. Resident Evil Revelations is split into episodes, so a lot of the gameplay segments are very short and for no reason whatsoever include these like next time on or like previously on segments, and there's no reason for that. But yeah, when you're playing as like Chris or those two hacker guys who are completely useless characters, a lot of it just feels like complete filler. It doesn't really feel like it's helping the story at all. And yeah, I just don't like most of those segments. If it was just a simple action horror game on this boat, which I think is a great setting, it would be much better. But I think in order to pad the length of the game, for whatever reason, they had to shove in all this other stuff that I don't like at all. The reuse of assets becomes pretty clear at times as well. Also, another weird thing about this game is that for the whole game you have a partner, even though I'm pretty sure it's not a multiplayer game. At least in the single player, you can't go co-op. So very weird. Just a lot of weird decisions. I feel like, they were trying to do a lot with this game, and it doesn't always work out. There's some weird sci-fi stuff in this game, too. Lots of things that don't feel very Resident Evil-ish. I almost feel like this game should have taken place in the future, because there's like giant kill satellites and floating cities and stuff. But at the same time, I think that games like this kind of help establish Resident Evil as its own setting, because after the Raccoon City incident, the world changed a lot. It was basically like 9/11, so the war on bioterror happened. And games like these kind of feed into that idea. I guess it's a part of the greater mythos of Resident Evil, but it's not really an essential game, even though I kind of like some of it. Okay, so here we are, Resident Evil 6. Let's put this at the bottom. So yeah, this is a game that is not good. Really not good, but I actually don't think this game is as terrible as some people have made it out to be. The weirdest thing about playing through this game is it's kind of like playing like a Call of Duty game or a super expensive AAA release. This is like a Japanese equivalent of that. This game cost a lot to make. It had a massive number of employees working on it. This was like probably one of the most intense projects Capcom ever made. And you can see it. You can really see it in a lot of ways. This game feels very, very over-designed in many different aspects. From the menus, to the controls, to all of the set pieces, to the enemies. It feels like lots of time was spent on every aspect of this game. But at the end of the day, it's not even remotely scary. And the story is terrible. And any charm action games like Resident Evil 4 and 5 had is totally gone now. You're basically just fighting Call of Duty enemies who can occasionally mutate. It's a very strange game. But I think that if you took this game, the engine for this game, the foundation as an action game, there's actually some pretty interesting controls here. You could make an interesting game out of it, but it didn't happen. That's why this just goes at the bottom. I think this really is rock bottom for the whole franchise. Because they ran out of ideas. They totally ran out of ideas. they realize, oh crap, Wesker's gone. We don't have a main villain anymore. And this is just like an awkward Avengers storyline where everyone has to come together, sort of, to fight a lame villain that nobody cares about or will remember. Yeah, this is the worst Resident Evil game. There's just no way around it. Despite being a very profitable game, it wasn't profitable enough, and so it's basically been kicked to the curb, and you'll never remember it. Still, though, if you find this on sale, and, like, you got a friend who has it, you might want to play some of this. I wouldn't say play through the whole game, but maybe try playing, like, Leon or Chris's campaign for a bit. It's an interesting experience. Okay, so after that we had Resident Evil Revelations 2. This is going in C tier as well. This is not really that different quality-wise. It has some of the same problems. I think that the story is not that great either. There are some interesting ideas, but they just don't go far enough with them. I don't even know why Claire Redfield is in this game. That was weird. It was like totally forced. I don't know why she's like the main character. Really, the main character is like Barry and his daughter Moira. Like the whole story is about them, but I don't know why Claire was shoved in there. It's very weird. I mean, there's some neat ideas. Last of Us crafting. You carry bricks around to find places to climb, kind of like in Last of Us. Yeah, this game actually rips The Last of Us off quite a bit now that I'm thinking about it. Yeah, I don't know. It's all right. It kind of doesn't even feel like a Resident Evil game at times. It feels like a totally unrelated thing. Another very strange thing I should bring up about this game. This is an episodic game. I don't know why. All of the episodes of this game were released within a month of each other, so there's really no reason to sell it into chunks like you would a Telltale game, because the game was complete when it was released. I think the reason they did that was because they just had no faith that anybody would buy this because of Resident Evil 6. So they basically said, hey, you can get the first episode for, a little bit of money, and then hopefully you'll like the rest and buy it. I think they were just playing it safe. So, yeah, as an episodic experience, I don't think this really works at all. Even the way they try to do that in the narrative, where you play as Claire and Moira, and then you play as Barry, like 6 months later. Even that, to me, feels like a huge gimmick. It's kind of obnoxious, too, because Barry has to backtrack through a lot of places that you already explored. And sometimes it's interesting, sometimes it's not. It's nice to have Barry back, though. Barry's kind of the best part of the game, to be completely honest. Again, only for hardcore fans. This is also a co-op game. You can play this with a friend, but player 2 doesn't really get to do that much, so I'm not sure I can recommend it there either. And that brings us to the end. Certainly not the end of the franchise, but the end, which is Resident Evil 7. Going in A tier. Resident Evil 7, a game I was very, very apprehensive about, mostly because of how it was being marketed at the time, before it came out. That demo that they did and some other things, it kind of felt like they were trying to crack into the PT hype. The finished game does not really resemble PT at all, so that was weird and definitely confused me at the time. But Resident Evil 7, very good survival horror game. Really boils down Resident Evil. Takes everything, you put everything that's good about it in a pot, and you boil it down until you had like a thick demi-glace. And that's really the best way to put it, because this is a short, but it's a super protein-packed sauce. That's what this game is like. It's not that long. There's not that much depth to it. When you think about certain aspects of the story for more than 5 minutes, they don't really make any sense. But this game is kind of like a spin-off in a sense, where it is super detached from anything else in the franchise, but it's very entertaining. It does have a problem that you see with things like Resident Evil 2 and a couple other games, where the introductory parts are super exciting and then the subsequent parts just aren't that great. This is still a very fun game, but I wouldn't be lying if I said I didn't feel like there needed to be more to it. If it was longer, it just could have been a lot more interesting. There are some really neat ideas, like when you're going through the testing facility, some of the puzzles that you have to do, traps and things like that. I wish those had been explored in more detail. I also do not like how you get your ending in this game. The endings that you can pick, they feel very forced. It feels like it was decided at the last minute that there would be 2 endings, because they're really not different, honestly. it doesn't feel satisfying to play the game twice to get the other ending. But yeah, this is definitely a great game. It is very different from other Resident Evil things, and that's what's frustrating. A lot of the ideas that I would have liked to see them explore more would have made the game even more different from a Resident Evil game. That's kind of the issue, was they didn't want to stray too far. And we'll see what happens whenever Resident Evil 8 comes out. Maybe that's where it'll stray too far. Or maybe things will continue in this direction and it'll be super great. I don't know. I'm glad that Resident Evil can kind of rebound because it goes from its lulls to its highs. It's a very interesting franchise, and it's a big part of Japanese gaming and Western gaming. It's a cross-national franchise. Easily one of my favorite things that Capcom does. So, thank you for listening to me ramble about Resident Evil for a while. And everybody, keep on staying safe. You guys are smart. And hopefully I'll see you soon with something that's not a tier list. Peace.